I am a primatologist, and so I think my contribution to your conference these couple of days will be to give you a perspective on Darwin and Darwin's ideas about early human evolution from the study of wild great apes, especially wild chimpanzees, something I've been doing and my graduate students have been doing for a very long time. And my intention is to tell you where we are at this stage in our 100 years or so of study. I'm going to show you some of the work of my recent and not so recent graduate students. Let's start with our family tree. So you've heard a lot already about our phylogeny, and I will simply say that I always begin a talk like this by warning everyone listening that there is such a strong tendency to think of chimpanzees and bonobos, their close relatives, as under-evolved humans. Of course, we did not evolve from chimpanzees. We and chimpanzees have the same common ancestor that lived, as you heard, somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago. And the lineages that you see there, depicted very simply, have diverged. And over the past 6 million years, we and chimpanzees have gone on into very different directions. So ironically, even though I used chimpanzees for most of my career to understand early hominin evolution, they really are not the best models for many aspects of human biology. For instance, even though we've experimented on them for a century or more, they make poor models for aspects of biomedicine. Chimpanzees do not get many of the most common cancers that humans do. Chimpanzee heart disease manifests very differently than in humans. So there are limits, but in general, I think we can use chimpanzees as a kind of a reality check to try to understand something about ourselves. So as you've heard already with Mark Stoneking's talk, Bernard Wood's talk, Don Johansson's talk yesterday, and you'll hear more tomorrow, and also all the talks in Persian, there are different approaches to the understanding of where we came from. Darwin knew of all of these. In some sense, he understood all of these, maybe except number 4 here. But of course, in Darwin's day, very, very few, practically no human fossils have been discovered, and they certainly were not well understood. He was fascinated by the orangutan in the London Zoo, so he understood that connection between ourselves and our close relatives. Of course, he didn't know what genes were, let alone DNA, so molecular genetics was not something he could begin to approach. And considering the lack of information in his day, he did an amazing job of trying to understand human origins that he published sort of in The Origin of Species, but not really, but then 12 years later in his second great book, The Descent of Man. So today I'm really talking about number 2. But it's really important to remember that the only actual physical direct evidence for where we came from is the fossils themselves. Everything else is in a certain sense circumstantial, even as important as it is. So genetically speaking, we know a great deal these days about the similarities and differences between humans and chimpanzees. I just put this slide up simply to say that there are these figures that are out there. I put 98.8% identical. That still leaves an enormous number of loci at which there are differences between us. The functional differences between humans and chimps and the other apes genetically is really what matters. So there are a number of important figures in our field, and you're hearing from some of my most esteemed colleagues in the world these couple of days. But I like to point out Jane Goodall. And if you don't know who Jane Goodall is, she is today an iconic global figure representing environmental issues and social issues, but she's also a pioneering primatologist. And this is a big year for Jane and for all of us who know and love Jane, because she is turning 90 years old on April 3rd, so just a few weeks from now. But I also always want to point out that as important an early researcher as Jane Goodall was, beginning in 1960 when she went to Africa and began what is probably the most important and certainly the longest study of animal behavior of any kind of animals ever conducted, and still continues today, that there are many other individuals. And one such individual who passed away a few years ago is my Japanese colleague, Toshisada Nishida. In general, the world does not know Nishida's name nearly as well as Goodall's name, and that's really unfortunate. It's partly because he didn't have the attention of the Western media for the decades that Jane has, but it's also because Jane Goodall was the pioneer who made many discoveries that I'll talk about in the next few minutes about chimpanzees. Nishida, 5 years later, he began his study 5 years later, only 100 kilometers from Goodall's study in Tanzania, in East Africa, and he confirmed all of the findings that Goodall had made. So, you know, the way science works is when you make the discovery, you are the person we all look to. And when you're the person who confirms those discoveries, which is really equally important, you don't get the front page. And so Nishida is a very important name to remember in the history of study of primates. All right, so the life cycle of a chimpanzee is strikingly similar to that of a human, up to a certain point. So let's compare females first. Here's just a very simple version of the life cycle of a female chimpanzee, born after a very similar length pregnancy to our own, several years of nursing, physical dependence, meaning if the mom dies, the nursing baby will die. There's very, very little adoption in chimpanzee communities in the wild. And then even after weaning, after the baby is no longer dependent on mother's milk, the baby is psychologically dependent on the mom for years after that. And if the mom dies during that time, even though the baby can feed itself, the juvenile can feed itself, the baby will still struggle to survive because there's not really a network of adoption in chimp society. A female chimpanzee goes through puberty, roughly age 11. That's quite similar to humans. First birth is typically the mid-teenage years. Again, similar, at least biologically similar to a human species. And then a baby about every 4 years until death. And I have there no menopause. Now, there are some very recent data suggesting that menopause may exist in female chimpanzees based on some of the field studies. But I think we can say it's not really very similar to what we see in humans. There's no absolute cliff or ending to the reproductive cycling as we see in humans. And it's also important to point out that chimpanzees' reproductive system kind of develops over time during her life at a very similar rate to the rest of her body. Whereas in humans, our reproductive systems for women, again, stops at a much earlier stage of our lifespan. So female chimpanzees might live to be 40 in the wild and 60 in captivity, but they retain the ability to reproduce well into their 50s and even 60s, which is something that we don't see in humans. So there are these interesting differences that most likely have evolutionary meanings that we don't 100% understand yet. Meanwhile, when we talk about a male's life or a male's career, they're driven by different motivations. The motivation by both male and female is to successfully reproduce, of course, and successfully have offspring that grow up. But males have a very different approach to doing that. This is the same chimpanzee at 3 stages of his life, one of Jane Goodall's famous chimpanzees. Frodo, who is probably still the largest chimpanzee recorded weight-wise at Gombe, at Goodall's field site, and was an alpha male for a period of time. Here he is at age 18. He's a teenager. He's huge. He's physically powerful. He's not socially intelligent yet, just like most teenagers are not yet. And then in his 30s, he's beginning to look older, but he's a politically powerful animal. And then a photo taken by another researcher just before he died. He doesn't look like the same animal. He'd acquired some kind of a disease, never really diagnosed. And during this time, my point in showing you this slide is that he, of course, has the same genotype. His phenotype, his physical appearance changes dramatically, but his genotype is the same, and he's fathering offspring at all of these stages. So in terms of what drives female chimpanzee mating system, reproductive system, it's interesting just to note that when Frodo was even 12 and 14 years old, he was secretly fathering offspring with adult females in the community. So again, a career that we'd like to understand better. And when we talk about humans, this is a little conference paper that I did with colleagues a few years ago. You know, we have this idea, if we look at, for instance, well, any world leader, but US presidents, You see a photo when they took office, you see a photo when 8 years later they're done being president, and they always look much older. Their hair has gone gray, and we tend to think, oh, it's all about the stress of being president or being any world leader. It really ages you. But in fact, when we looked at the data, both for US presidents and for male chimpanzees, what we found is that males who become alpha or men who become president live significantly longer than those who don't. And there are a lot of different factors here. In the human case, of course, in early American history, many of the men who became president were from very wealthy families, even now today to a lesser extent. So they had benefits of medicine that others didn't have. But it's interesting because we think of being at the top as being very stressful, but there's obviously something very good about being at the top also in terms of male lifespan. This is something that one of my grad students did. We all focus on aggression and violence in primate societies. We try to understand human violence by understanding animal aggression and lethal aggression, which chimpanzees certainly engage in. So one of my graduate students, Jess Hartle, did a lovely study of reconciliation in wild chimpanzees. We know less about reconciliation, but it's equally important because an extremely high percentage of all the interactions that happen in chimpanzee society involve not hurting someone else, but either maintaining or reestablishing harmony in the community. And that's often the role of the alpha, is to maintain stability and harmony. But there has to be a mechanism for that. And this obviously applies to human societies as well. It applies to relationships in families, among friends, and between nations. There have to be mechanisms for maintaining some kind of harmony. So male chimpanzees are famous for being very aggressive. In fact, they're one of the few primates, other than humans, that engage in lethal territoriality. So here are a couple of photos taken by one of my former graduate students, Martin Muller. And these were taken at his research site in Uganda when he was doing his PhD. On the bottom, you see a male chimpanzee who wandered into an area that was a disputed area between the territories of two communities of chimpanzees. And in that area, he was essentially lost, it appears, and he was attacked by the males of the neighboring community, which were being studied, which Martin was following. And you can see the result. This male was killed. The close-up photos, which I would not want to show you, are very brutal. He was brutally killed. And all of the injuries were, chimpanzees don't have claws like a lion or a tiger. They have nails like ours. The injuries were all done through brutal aggression with teeth and also with hands, with fists. And then on the top side, just an interesting perspective on this. These are the organs of that chimpanzee that were done on necropsy, and you can see that obviously the one hand holds the brain of that chimpanzee, and another hand holds one of the two testicles of that male. And we often joke that these are the two organs that drive male chimpanzee behavior the most, and sometimes one takes precedence and sometimes the other one takes precedence. Above all else, chimpanzees are amazing forest rangers. They have an amazing ability, because they're big brain, because they're smart, at understanding their environment. So this is taken in Gambia and Tanzania many years ago, and this fig tree is the only fig tree of that species that grows in the national park where the chimps live. And every September, it would put out massive quantities of fruit. The chimpanzees knew where it was. They would return to it year after year. They would eat every single fruit on the tree over a period of days. And then they would walk away somewhere, and their droppings, their feces, would contain the seeds of these figs. We would debate, and we still debate, the spatial memory of chimpanzees. Do they know where every single tree in the forest is? That would be thousands of trees. Or do they know where some trees are that are favored, that are needed, and then they locate other trees in the course of their travels? And I always would draw the analogy to if you go to a market once a week to do your shopping, and if that market were not the size of a normal market, but were instead several square kilometers in size, if you spent your entire life in that market, you would know where everything is. You would know exactly what season and what month. You would find certain fruits and certain vegetables because that's when they're available. And so chimpanzees may have that level of spatial memory, and that's something else that we find fascinating in terms of understanding, for instance, the way our ancestors used the landscapes that they lived on. So chimpanzees are primarily fruit eaters. This is something that is consistent across many different forests in Africa. In equatorial Africa, they also eat leaves, but an interesting small percentage of their diet you can see here, and this is based on the time spent feeding, and it's a very generic pie based on many studies averaged together. They also eat meat, meaning the muscle tissue of other vertebrate animals, particularly other primates. And they also consume honey because they love to raid bee nests, beehives. And they also eat insects such as termites and ants. This has been studied for many years, and it was actually Goodall herself who in 1960-61 discovered a chimpanzee using a stick to probe into a termite mound, these enormous earthen mounds that will hold 10 million or more termites. And these are very large termites. These are large insects. And she'll put that probe, which she has stripped of leaves, into the termite mound, and then she'll draw it out, and the termites will defend their nest by clinging to the stick with their jaws, and she will eat them all. And I had a grad student, I think I have a slide here, Rob O'Malley, who studied the nutritional ecology of this behavior and really did a wonderful job mapping the use of the mounds with GPS, understanding the spatial memory that chimpanzees have of where the mounds are located and the most direct routes between them, and also understanding the nutritional value of different kinds of termites, ants, and other insects that the chimps include in their diet. In general, these insects are a wonderful source of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So we have many different kinds of tools that have been discovered. We can truly talk about chimpanzees as cultural animals, and really the realization that this wasn't just a random thing happening in some forests, but rather a systematic behavior across almost all the forests where chimpanzees live in Africa, really emerged only over the past 20 or so years as we began to pool the long-term data from many studies together. And now we can really say something about that. But here are some recent examples of chimp tool technologies that we did not know about in the early days of chimp research. Composite tools, meaning the chimps will use a big branch, a big stick to break open a termite mound or an ant nest, and then they'll switch to a smaller stick in order to gather the insects inside. Digging sticks, which are used in various places to, for instance, in the dry season when water is not available, when the streams may stop flowing, the chimps will use sticks to dig into the sand or the soil until they reach water under the ground so they can drink water out of it. Hunting spears, in quotes, because they're not really spears. The media called them spears, but my colleague Jill Preetz in Senegal has done a wonderful study approaching 20 years now, and she's documented chimpanzees there using branches and sticks to insert into holes in trees in order to either kill or injure small animals in those trees and then pull them out and eat them. So another protein source. So they're using a weapon in hunting, and that's really the only case in which chimps use tools as weapons. And then finally, chimpanzee archaeology, which fascinates people interested in human evolution, because we now know that in some forests in West Africa, there are aggregations, there are gatherings of stone tools that chimps have found in the forest and brought to a central place in order to use as hammers and crack open nuts. And then those tools have been left there. And over a period of time, thousands of years, they've become covered with layers of soil, so we can actually dig down into the soil and uncover these tools. So actual archaeology, material culture created by chimpanzees. Yeah, so here's the study by my student, Rob O'Malley. He really got a good handle on why chimps are eating these different animals. He also mapped the different termite mounds. He studied the insect side of this system as well as he studied the human side. Another grad student recently finished who did a genetic study. So in many parts of Africa, as Africa develops and human populations grow, chimpanzees are living in closer and closer proximity to people. And Marie McCarthy did a lovely study using mitochondrial DNA of trying to understand the composition and the nature of chimpanzee communities living in areas where they were crop raiding, where they were invading farms to take food that people are growing out of the farms as part of their diet. And people are harassing the chimps. So the chimps are afraid of people. They can't really be watched or approached closely. So she collected chimp feces and did a study that, in fact, she worked in Max Planck, where Mark Stoneking is located, for her postdoc work to really understand what was going on there. So these are the kinds of things we can do these days, especially in a changing world in which humans and chimpanzees live closer and closer together. So my own work, done beginning long ago, which I'll just summarize now, was really about chimpanzee meat eating. And there was a long literature going back to the 1960s and Goodall's earliest observations of chimps as meat eaters. But it was always an issue of, well, chimpanzees eat meat, but so little that it really doesn't give us any kind of meaning of the earliest or hominin meat eating. And the fossil record is, of course, that about 3 million years ago, we see clear evidence of meat eating because we find cut marks made by ancient stone tools on ancient fossilized bones of the animals that were being eaten. It's hard to say whether the animals were killed or scavenged, but we have clear evidence of meat eating based on these stone tool cut marks. But before that, we don't have a signature in the archaeological record. So we turned to chimpanzees to try to get a window into what might have been going on. And that's really was the justification for what I did. This was my postdoc work initially long ago, and some of my students have followed this along. I have a graduate student right now preparing to go back to the field and continue kind of more sophisticated questions related to what I did back then. So first of all, we know that meat was an important part of the diet. We don't know how important. The signature is not clear. Did earliest humans eat meat once a week, once a month, once a decade? We don't know this. We don't know the answer to that. We know that animal protein and fat is in short supply in a forest. In most African forests, a chimp could probably find more fat in plant foods than in animal foods, and at much less cost in terms of calories expended hunting and trying to catch animals. Of course, the fat would probably not be saturated fat. It probably wouldn't have the same amino acid composition and so forth that animal protein, that meat would, but the protein and fat is there. It's in short supply in general if you're going to look for animal protein, and it has to be caught. And also, lastly, some of my work focused on what does the meat mean to the animals once it's been caught and killed. You see this as a chimp on the bottom. This is actually Freud, one of the early chimpanzees from Goodall's study at Gombe, who's tearing apart a colobus monkey, eating a colobus. And meat is obviously of nutritional value, but then it also takes on a role in chimp social systems in terms of being a tool for bartering, for securing an alliance, for snubbing a rival. And it becomes part of their politics. So that made it also an interesting topic to study. So at Gombe, there had been one brief study of hunting behavior done by Geza Telecki in the late 60s. He was a grad student at Penn State in the US at the time. But when I approached Goodall about doing this in the 1990s, no one had done anything very systematic on hunting. Now, today, in the 2020s, we have more studies that are longer term and more systematic than mine was. But at the time, it was the most detailed study. So what we learned through the study that I did and with students is that most hunting is done by males. It's really a male behavior. And when I say here that the behavior is partly female driven, I'll come back to this. What I mean is that female reproductive cycles and female swelling cycles, because female chimps develop these swellings on their rear ends when they're ovulating, these encourage males to be social because the males gather around the females because they all want to mate with her. And that leads to the males being in numbers, and that leads to the males hunting and being successful when they hunt. 2/3 of encounters result in hunts, but not all. One of my key questions was to try to understand when chimpanzees are walking along the forest floor and they encounter a tree holding colobus monkeys, that's the main food, why do they hunt sometimes but not other times? And that was something I devoted a lot of time to and lots of publications about. They're successful about half the time. That might not sound extremely high, but actually that success rate, that in half of all hunts, at least one prey animal, like a monkey, sometimes a pig, is killed, That's an extremely high success rate. That's higher than you would find for wolves. It's higher than you would find for lions or cheetahs or leopards or most carnivores. And those animals, of course, are carnivores. Their diet is 100% meat, whereas chimpanzees are more like us. They're omnivores, whose diet may contain some fraction of meat. And in addition to being successful half the time, they sometimes will make kills of many animals at the same time. So in my case, the maximum was 7 in a group of 30 monkeys. The chimpanzees attacked, the male chimpanzees attacked, and about 1/4 of the group of monkeys were actually killed. These are old data from my study showing that hunting is seasonal. And in most studies in Africa of chimpanzee hunting, the hunting is seasonal. Now, it happens that in Tanzania, where these data come from, there are 2 dry seasons, and the hunting peaks, and these are raw numbers of hunts, are in the dry season, in the 2 dry seasons, and particularly July, August, September. So that's interesting because the data that we have from some early hominin sites in the same region in East Africa suggests the same thing. And as to why that would be, there are lots of ideas about that. Some people initially thought, well, maybe there's less food available in the dry season, so the chimps hunt in order to have more protein in their diet, in order to just have meat. But in fact, when we began to do detailed vegetation studies, we learned that in fact, there's a lot of food available in the dry season. The leaves are not there, but in some forests, fruits are widely available. And so depending on the composition of nutrients that you're seeking, the chimps don't really need to hunt more in the dry season. So something else might be going on. And as it turned out, what we found was that this was related to, at Gombe at least, female reproductive cycles. Female chimpanzees do not give birth seasonally. They give birth at a relatively consistent rate in every month of the year, but their swellings, their cycles, their visual cycles in terms of those swellings that they get are seasonal. And that contributes to chimp hunting. We also found that meat consumption was very interestingly higher than we expected. So grams per day, now this doesn't look like a lot. If you were to buy a hamburger in a cafe somewhere, you would get a lot more grams of meat and of protein and fat just in that one hamburger than any of these are showing. But in terms of the average amount of meat being consumed by chimps during the peak hunting months, this is more than we expected. And so it meant that when we do comparisons of traditional human hunters, so-called hunter-gatherers or foragers, and we compare them to what modern chimps do, we find that chimps are not somewhere off the bottom of the graph, but rather somewhere in the lower third or so of the graph, depending on the comparison that we're making. And that was really unexpected. So just turning a little bit, another one of my former graduate students did a wonderful study trying to understand the role of hormones in chimpanzee behavior, in the behavior of male chimpanzees. We've known for a long time that testosterone plays a role in the social lives of human males and non-human animal males as well. If you, for instance, were to watch 2 men playing tennis, you find after the tennis match, although you might think that the winner of the match would experience a rise in testosterone because he won the match. In fact, what we really see is that the loser of the match experiences a drop in testosterone. So that's been demonstrated also in wild non-human primates. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford University was the first to really show that for wild baboons. And Martin Muller was the first person to show that that's also true for chimpanzees. This is really important because, you know, we want to have a baseline of some kind for understanding that the mediation of aggression involving endocrine systems, involving hormones, and he really was able to begin to address that. The hardest part of the study was obtaining the samples. He used urine, and he relied on the fact that when male chimpanzees wake up in the morning, high in a tree where they've slept the night before, the first thing they do in the morning is what we all do, they urinate, and then he was able to catch that. This is actually the son of one of my colleagues, Richard Wrangham, years ago, catching some of the urine, and then that gave Martin his sample, and he used either liquid nitrogen to freeze it, or he used filter paper to be able to analyze the content of what was in it. And that at the time was quite pioneering work as well. All right, finally, just to do a comparison here, I mentioned hunter-gatherers, and I said in my first slide or two that they were one of the other ways that we try to understand our ancestors. So first of all, obviously these people in the small pockets of the world where they still exist, because they're persecuted everywhere they live, they've been persecuted. Whether we're talking about Native Americans or people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, wherever, these people are modern people. They are cognitively as the same as you or me, but their technologies are very simple and very traditional. And so we like to study them, anthropologists have for generations, to try to understand what earlier humans who had simpler technologies might have done, how they might have lived off the land. My comparisons have mostly been between chimpanzees and these people to try to understand the energetics of being a human hunter versus being a chimpanzee hunter. And so there are some differences that are really important here. So for instance, humans hunt larger animals. And if you have several hunters together, usually they're men, they are potentially hunting big animals, a giraffe or a zebra, whereas chimpanzees are always hunting small animals. They have never been recorded to kill anything larger than about 20 kilos, and usually much, much smaller than that, usually just a few kilos, like a monkey. Chimpanzees we don't believe they plan hunting at all. They hunt opportunistically, meaning they are looking for fruit, they're looking for leaves, and they may opportunistically encounter a group of monkeys in a tree and then hunt those monkeys and potentially catch one or more. Whereas humans, of course, set out in the morning, often with a plan. We're going to go this way because we think there's a herd of animals this way. And when they reach the animals, if they find them, then there's a coordination of the hunt also. And that's the last item on this list, that humans will coordinate their hunting either by gestures or by something vocal, yelling to each other, whistling to each other. And that is something chimpanzees do not do. Bipedal versus quadrupedal, the third point, chimpanzees walk quadrupedally. They, contrary to most people's images of a chimp climbing in the trees, they climb to find fruit, they climb to sleep, to make a nest, but most of their travel is on the ground, sometimes for kilometers every day. And humans walk bipedally, of course, and we know that bipedal walking is a more efficient way of getting around than quadrupedal walking of the kind, knuckle walking, that chimpanzees do. So if you're bipedal and you're an efficient walker, you probably have the ability to save the calories that chimps are spending. So you can walk much further, and maybe that allows you to plan hunting, to be able to go out and say, we're looking for meat today. And as I said earlier, chimpanzees, except for that one case that I mentioned in Senegal, do not use weapons when they're hunting, whereas humans routinely do, whether they're spears, bows and arrows, or whatever. And chimpanzee cooperation in hunting has been a disputed topic for a long time. I had arguments in the early days of my research because I never felt, based on my data, that the chimps were actually cooperating, and other researchers did. And I think the consensus today would be that the male chimps are acting together, but not cooperating actively with one another, that there's power in numbers, but that each male is out for his own intake of food and not really thinking about anything altruistically, and then the coordination that I mentioned. And so, yeah, finally, we then, with a colleague, Caleb Finch, who's a prominent authority on the origins of meat eating and also nutrition and the aging process, we did a paper long ago that looked at the aspects of meat eating in terms of human evolution. And we basically argued that it was the origin of bipedalism, and that there was even genetic evidence to suggest that when you add meat to the diet in a significant way, there's a downside. There may be a downside in terms of correlations with infectious disease. There may be a downside. Finch is an expert on dementia and Alzheimer's, and he believes that it's linked to diet, and that the origin of meat eating may have been linked to the onset of those diseases in the human species, but that we really dramatically changed our biological plan as a result of the addition of meat to the diet in a way that took off exponentially when humans began to walk bipedally and then began to use weapons in a systematic way. Okay, I don't know if I've exceeded my time or if I'm on time, but thank you for listening.